All right, so we're going to be taking a look at chapter 18 of our Memler's textbook right now. That is going to be covering the respiratory system. So today we're going to be looking at the structures within that system and how they're all kind of shaped. The process of what we refer to when we say respiration, there's sort of two versions of respiration. There's sort of the breathing that's happening at your lungs, which we all kind of think of when we think of respiration. It's like I'm getting oxygen into my bloodstream, right?
Right.
But there's also the cellular respiration that's happening at body tissue levels where oxygen molecules are entering our cells. And those are both like an exchange of gases, CO2 for oxygen or oxygen for CO2, depending on where you're at. So we're going to talk a little bit about that ventilation process and that gas exchange process, how it's transported, and then sort of what the abnormal versions of that are, like hyperventilation or hypoventilation. Then we're going to break into some of the disorders. We're actually going to move through this pretty quickly. Honestly, we're not going to spend too much time talking about this. We'll probably mention COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders, but that's something that we cover much more in depth next mod in sort of the senior section. So we'll move through that relatively fast. Same thing with the aging and specialized equipment for treatment. That's definitely something that we're not really going to cover, remember, all this stuff is very medical based, which is not necessarily our role. So before we dive into that, you guys know I want to start you off with some animations. So let's go ahead and watch this little video here and take a look at what it looks like inside of our lungs, and then we'll dive on into the notes.
Let me introduce you to one of the bravest pioneers in the history
of life on planet Earth. An organism that blazed the trail for every single vertebrate that lives on land today and many that don't. It's one of your most important ancestors. Meat? Well, it doesn't have a name. And we don't exactly know what it looked like either. But we do know that about 380 million years ago, this fishy-looking thing with big fleshy fins achieved one of the animal kingdom's greatest milestones: breathing air. Sounds simple enough, but believe me, it wasn't. Because for billions of years before this fishy ancestor came around, basically all of life evolved in water. From the very beginning, the earliest, simplest forms of life, like bacteria, extracted oxygen they needed right from the water through their membranes. And they did it through simple diffusion, when a material automatically flows from where it is concentrated to where it is less concentrated, so it balances out. Diffusion works really well, and it requires zero effort, but it wasn't going to cut it in the big leagues. Anything larger than a small worm is simply too big and needs too much oxygen for diffusion to work. So in order to get bigger, early life forms needed a circulatory system that could move bulk amounts of oxygen around faster inside their bodies, and a respiratory system to bring more oxygen in contact with their wet membranes. So their respiratory surfaces moved from their outer surfaces to the insides of their bodies. First there were gills, but gills of course still only work inside of water. And a little more than 380 million years ago, this was starting to lose some of its charm. Earth was getting warmer, the seas were getting shallower, and much of the planet's surface water had lower concentrations of oxygen than it used to. Finally, a humble little lobe-finned fish got fed up, swam up to the water's surface, and started breathing air. It could do this because it had evolved a fancy new interface to move gases between the air and its cell membranes. I'm talking about lungs. Wet lungs. With an efficient new way to take in nearly limitless amounts of oxygen from air, animals were eventually able to get bigger and more diverse over the ages, and now all of us lung-having vertebrates share that common ancestor. For lots of animals, including humans, those lungs come with a bunch of other equipment like protective ribs, a stiff trachea, and in mammals, a strong diaphragm. And together, they form your respiratory system, which happens to be best friends and business partners with your circulatory system. It's only by working together and using both the bulk flow and simple diffusion of oxygen that they can make possible the process of cellular respiration. In other words, life itself. So a lot of improvements have been made to it over the eons, but the respiratory system that you are using right now is your inheritance from that ancient, ambitious fish, leader of one of the most important anatomical revolutions of the past 500 million years. Pretend for a minute that you can't breathe. Like you just don't have lungs anymore. You are some bizarre evolutionary oddity, a huge human-shaped organism that doesn't have a respiratory system. Instead, you get all of your oxygen the way that your oldest, smallest evolutionary ancestors did, by simple diffusion, or at least you try to get all your oxygen that way. How would it work? Well, poorly, and that's partly because one of the keys to efficient diffusion of any material is distance. If you want a molecule to diffuse across a space quickly, you want it to be as close to its destination as possible with the fewest obstacles in the way. But for a single molecule of oxygen to diffuse from the air through, say, your scalp and then go to a neuron deep inside your brain, it would have to move through your skin and then your skull and then your connective tissue, all sorts of things. It would eventually get there, like maybe a month later, but at that point, the cell that needed the oxygen in the first place would have, suffocated to death. Basically, obtaining oxygen through diffusion alone is like wanting to go to a party at your friend's place across town and then walking 20 miles to get there. You could do it, but it would take forever, and by the time you arrived, you'd be all haggard and the party would be over. So diffusion alone isn't enough to get the job done. We do use it, but only when a whole bunch of the materials we need are right up against the tissues that can absorb them. So you know what else we need? Bulk flow. Bulk flow is like public transportation. It moves large numbers of molecules quickly. Rather than walk the whole way across town, you can hop on a bus with a bunch of other people and get there in 20 minutes. Every time you take a deep breath, you bring in about 100 quintillion oxygen molecules into your lungs all at once. They're on a bulk flow bus ride. And once those oxygen molecules filter down into the cells in your lungs, they're suddenly very close to the blood they're trying to reach. All they have to do is diffuse across 4 layers of cell membranes to get from the lung cell into the blood. It's like hopping off the bus and then walking a half a block to your friend's apartment. That's why your respiratory system is the way it is. It's set up to take full advantage of both bulk flow and simple diffusion. The bulk flow part of things is handled by some of your system's biggest and most obvious moving parts, starting with your lungs, which basically operate like a pump or a bellows. They don't have any contractible muscle tissue because they need to be able to expand, so they require outside help in order to move. Enter the diaphragm, a big thin set of muscles that separates your thorax from your abdomen. When your lungs empty, your diaphragm relaxes and looks kind of like an arc pushing up to squish your lungs. You also have the weight of your rib cage pushing on your lungs from the top and sides, and together these forces decrease the volume of your lungs. When you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, pulling itself flat, and your external intercostal muscles between your ribs contract. They lift the ribs up and out, causing the chest cavity to expand. This makes the pressure inside your lungs lower than the air outside your body, and since fluids like gases move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, the lungs fill up with outside air. Then the diaphragm relaxes again, and the weight of the ribs settles in, and the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the outside air, and the air rushes out. And that, my friends, is breathing 101. Now, your respiratory system contains a lot of parts besides your lungs, some prominently displayed on your face, others hidden deep within your chest, and functionally all of these organs fall into one of 2 physiological zones. The upper parts that funnel the air in make up what's known as the conducting zone, and it starts with this thing. Your nose is supported by bone and cartilage and the bristly hairs and mucus inside it that help filter out dust and other particles. But it, along with your sinuses, performs another important function. It warms and moistens incoming air so it doesn't dry out those sensitive lung cells that must remain wet. Remember, moisture is key. We evolved from organisms that lived in water, so just like with our aquatic bacterial ancestors, we need water for oxygen to dissolve into before it can diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer membrane of our cells. Now, if you've ever choked on a poorly timed sip of water, you've noticed that you breathe through the same tube that you also move foods and liquids through. This is yet another leftover from those first fish lungs, which evolved as a branch off the esophagus. Looking back, it was not ideal, but we are stuck with it. So the stuff that you swallow soon encounters the epiglottis, a little trapdoor of tissue which covers the larynx and directs bites of sandwich and sips of cola towards your esophagus and keeps them out of your lungs. And you'll notice that the esophagus, which heads to your stomach, is nice and flexible, while your trachea, or windpipe, is rigid and has prominent rings. That's because your trachea is basically built like a vacuum hose. Since the lungs create negative pressure with every breath, the trachea needs those rings to keep it open. If it were soft and floppy, it would collapse every time the pressure dropped and you wouldn't be able to breathe. From there, the trachea splits in 2, forming the right and left main bronchi. You can imagine these inner lung parts as sort of an upside-down tree. Now we are in the lung tissue and have entered what we call the respiratory zone. This is where the actual gas exchange occurs, and everything you find here has a form to suit that function. So the smaller branches of the upside-down tree are bronchioles, which taper down into progressively narrower tubes until they empty into the alveolar ducts and then dead end into tiny alveolar sacs, where the bulk of the gas exchange finally occurs. Because that's where each sac contains a cluster of alveoli, these tiny cavities lined with super thin wet membranes made of simple squamous epithelium tissue. It's here that oxygen molecules dissolve in the wet mucus, diffuse across the epithelial cells, and then cross the single layer of endothelial cells lining the capillaries to enter the bloodstream. And of course, it's also where carbon dioxide CO2 diffuses out of the blood and then follows the same route back up to the nose and mouth where it's exhaled. So it's your alveoli where diffusion meets bulk flow, because while you're picking up oxygen and dispensing with CO2 one molecule at a time, you're doing it in enormous quantities at any given second. Both of your lungs contain about 700 million alveoli, which together provide an amazing 75 square meters of moist membrane surface area. So the principles that make respiration possible are relatively simple: diffusion and bulk flow. And so are the mechanisms in your body that use them. It just took us about 400 million years to figure out how to make it all work. But today you learned how it does work, including the mechanics of both simple diffusion and bulk flow, and the physiology of breathing, and the anatomy of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone of your respiratory system. Thank you to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for themselves and for everyone in the world for free with their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor was Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Ronda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so lungs are kind of a fun one. There's a lot of working parts here, but there's sort of two main things that are happening, kind of like he mentions, right? Like there is bulk flow, and then there is also simple diffusion. Remember, diffusion is just something that is moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, which is where stuff naturally wants to move, you know? The example I always give is like, picture you have like a sack full of marbles or something. You know, all those marbles are kind of bound up in this thing, but if you were to like cut that sack open, they would just go everywhere afterwards, because they are going to move from an area where they're all very tightly compact to an area where they can be apart from one another, right? High pressure in the sack, low pressure anywhere outside of that sack. I mean, we got a pretty big planet here, you know? So that's what we're seeing in this, like in these like pressure changes. So when we're talking about the respiratory system, this is the system that's responsible for taking advantage of those two processes. And it does it so that it can ensure proper cellular functioning, right? So we literally, every cell in your body needs oxygen in order to survive. Like that is the most important thing that all of us need. You know, like I said, if you think about like the importance of things, it's like, yes, we need to eat food. Absolutely, we need to drink water, you know, but like oxygen is hugely important. It's the number one thing that we need in order to keep our cells alive, because the way our cells produce energy is by converting oxygen into high energy molecules called ATP. And we're going to talk more about that in the next couple of days. But without oxygen, we literally cannot do that. And so when we're talking about respiration, a lot of times, yes, we are talking about like breathing into our lungs and getting that oxygen into our bloodstream, but we are just as much talking about respiration at a cellular level, where oxygen molecules are diffusing into our cells. You know, again, one of the reasons why I love talking about cells so much, I think it's so fun, is like they're little versions of us, you know, every single one of them. And so like in the same way that we need to bring in a lot of oxygen, our cells need to be able to bring in a lot of oxygen. So our respiratory system is the system that's responsible for extracting oxygen from the environment so that it can be utilized by our body's cells. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and divide the process of respiration, which we give a definition here. Respiration is the process of obtaining oxygen from the environment. That's half of it, and delivering it to our cells. We are going to divide this into 4 sections, right? The first one's going to be pulmonary ventilation. That's the breathing that you're all doing right now. That's the breathing that you're thinking of when you generally tend to think of the respiratory system. You're like, yeah, it's my lungs. It's how I breathe, right? Yeah, absolutely. That's still very true. There's just more to it than that, right? Like, so our first process is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary means lungs. Ventilation means to like drive air from one place to another, right? So this is the process of driving massive amounts of gas or air into our lungs. And that's the thing. Gas is just it's air. You know, or air is just it's a gas, right? It's a gas with lots of stuff in it. It's not just oxygen. In fact, actually, most of the air that we breathe in is nitrogen. But oxygen is what we can drive into our body. So that's the stuff that we generally tend to talk about. And then what's going to happen is we're going to experience what we call external gas exchange. Okay, so external gas exchange kind of makes it sound as if you're just like diffusing oxygen straight through your skin, right? It sounds like it's like going from external to internal. That is still what's happening. It's just not happening at the skin. It's happening in the lungs, because this is the first time I'm going to mention this, but I'm definitely going to mention it again when we get to the digestive system. But you are a human donut. Okay, like every one of us, like we are all like, yes, like if you think about like if I were to like close my mouth, right? There's still empty space in there. And there's not like an actual closed wall, like, separating the inside of my mouth from the outside atmosphere here, right in my room. The only thing separating that is sort of a temporary close with my jaw here, right? Like I can close it, but it's not permanent. Same thing is true. If we travel that tube all the way back and we go into our lungs, your lungs are technically not inside your body. Again, that's a very weird thing to say, but like in the same way that my teeth are technically not, they're kind of part of the outside, right? The only thing separating them is my lips here, but like that's, again, like it's sort of a temporary wall. Same thing is true of your lungs. Your lungs are technically outside of the inner parts of your body, right? And so when we are driving oxygen in, we are just moving it from one part of the atmosphere into another that happens to be sort of surrounded by our body. But we need to get that oxygen into what is like really like inside our freaking body, which is like your bloodstream, right? Like that's the difference between something that we call like it being systemic, right? We got to get it into the actual system. So how do we get something to pass from one side to the other? Well, it's going to use simple diffusion to do this. This is why we call this an external gas exchange, because technically it's taking place outside your body, and now oxygen is passing to the inside part of your body. And once it's in there, great. Now we can transport it to where it needs to go. Okay. And that's what's going to happen next. So pulmonary ventilation is going to drive massive amounts of gas into your lungs. External gas exchange is going to drive oxygen into your red blood cells. They are going to literally pass through the wall from external to internal. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide, which is our byproduct of using oxygen, is going to pass outside of our cells. So now from our bloodstream, CO2 is going to pass in the other direction into the outside atmosphere there externally, right? And again, that's why this is external gas exchange. Technically, you could theoretically, oh God, I just had a mental image of, man, do you guys, this is going to be a deep cut. I don't know how many people are going to get this reference, but do you guys remember the show Rocko's Modern Life?
Yeah.
Dude, I loved that show when I was a kid. And there is an episode that they got away with weird stuff back in the day on kids shows. But there's an episode, I think, where I want to say it's the turtle character, his lungs get pulled out of out of his body, and like he's just carrying them around with him. Have not thought about that in a while, but you could do that theoretically. Like theoretically, you could technically do that, because again, it would still be able to like interact as long as there were blood vessels, connected to it that could get to it. It could still get inside you. That's just, chances are you'd tear all those blood vessels if we were ever to actually try to do something like that. Weird example. Hopefully I don't have any more of those weird ones today. Let's go ahead. So from external gas exchange, once we get rid of our CO2 and we pick up our oxygen, now it's sitting in our blood cells, right? And now our blood cells are traveling through our cardiovascular system, and they're going to transport that oxygen wherever it needs to go. And so step 3 is gas transport, right? And that's gonna, like, let's say I need to get, oxygen down to my calf muscles, right? Well, you know, a blood cell is going to pick it up and then it's going to go back through the heart. We talked about that yesterday, right? And then the heart is going to pump it down to my actual calf. And so that's where the transportation, the gas transport, is sort of going to occur. And then there's internal gas exchange. Once that red blood cell gets to my calf muscles, now it's going to drop off the oxygen that it's been carrying into my cells. And so now, exactly the opposite of what happened earlier is going to happen here. Earlier, during external gas exchange, we dropped off CO2, we picked up oxygen. Internal gas exchange is the reverse of that. We're going to drop off oxygen and we're going to pick up CO2. And then that blood cell is going to continue traveling. It'll probably keep going until it finally has delivered all of its oxygen. And then it's going to continue through that circuit until it eventually gets back to my heart. And then my heart's going to pump it over to my lungs so that it can go through that external gas exchange again. And that process is going to repeat over and over and over and over and over again. So we're taking advantage of bulk flow by creating an area of low pressure in our lungs thanks to our muscles. And that drives a massive amount of gas in. That gas becomes exposed to the blood because of there's like sort of on the other side of the wall, right? You can think of it as kind of like a screen door, you know, like, you know, it's certain, if you were to like, if you had like water with, I don't know, like, you had like a bunch of water with, let's say marbles, because I already talked about marbles. So let's say you had a bunch of marbles in like a bucket of water, right? And you took that whole bucket and you threw it against the screen door. The water would pass through the screen door, but the marbles would get stuck. That's what your lungs are doing. You're able to diffuse the water through, but the big friggin' marbles, they're not going to get through that screen door, right? And that's exactly how our gases work. You know, most of the air that we breathe into our lungs is actually nitrogen, but nitrogen does not pass into our bloodstream because we don't have the right slots for it, right? Our blood cells are not designed to carry that around. So what does pass into our bloodstream is the oxygen molecules. That's able to diffuse. And it diffuses because there's a low concentration of oxygen in the red blood cell, and there's a high concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere. So then again, nature will naturally move things from high concentration to low concentration. That's what drives oxygen in the direction we need it to go. And it does help that our red blood cells also have molecules of iron in them. Iron and oxygen really get along quite well. They're good friends. And so that also attracts oxygen molecules a little bit more effectively. So this is sort of like how that entire process works, right? If we look at this little chart right here, you can see like, you know, at the lungs, we're experiencing external gas exchange where oxygen's coming in and CO2 is going out. And then once it, you know, gets to like our body's cells, our tissues or whatever, we're going to experience internal gas exchange where we're going to drop off oxygen and we're going to pick up CO2. So now we can kind of look at like these colors here. We were representing them as like bright red blood and dark red blood earlier. Well, now we can talk about how like the reason your blood is so bright red, like when it becomes exposed to air. If you've ever seen like, you know, if you've ever like donated blood, and you've ever seen a freaking blood pack, the blood that's inside blood packs is crazy dark because there's just not any oxygen in that plastic bag, you know? But like when you cut yourself, it's bright red. Well, that's because there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. And so like once that blood cell becomes exposed to oxygen, it grabs it because again, blood has iron in it and iron is very attracted to oxygen. So that's why like it looks very, very different. Well, now we're going to kind of draw that here in this picture, right? We can see at our lungs, we're getting rid of the CO2, that's the blue, right? We're getting rid of carbon dioxide and we're picking up oxygen, right? So if a cell kind of came in here and, you know, experiences that exchange right now, it's like oxygenated because it got rid of all of its CO2, picked up its oxygen. Now it's going to travel back to the heart where it'll get, you know, it's going to go into the right atrium, into the, I'm sorry, the left atrium, into the left ventricle. It'll get pumped. And then it's going to travel up, and now it's going to drop off its oxygen, and it's going to pick up some CO2, and now it's a blue cell again. It's dark red, but and then it's going to travel back to that right atrium, right ventricle, and then get pumped back over to the lungs. And the process is just going to repeat over and over and over and over again. External respiration to internal respiration, back and forth. Any questions on that so far? How y'all feeling?
I'm good.
Cool.
I'm good.
Love it. Making sense. All right. So let's take a look at some of the structures here, right? If we're gonna talk about some of the anatomy within our respiratory system. So your respiratory system's anatomy, and NASM's going to break this down for sure here in just a little bit, but it's kind of broken into two primary sections. That's going to be your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways. So your respiratory passageways are things that are allowing air to travel like into your lungs. You know, for instance, these are your bronchi, right? So you have like your two primary bronchi. These are the two primary passageways that branch into each lung, right? They're these kind of, you know, cartilaginous empty tubes that allow like massive amounts of air to you know, kind of flow through it, right? And so like this branches down, and then it's going to break into two primary sections there. You'll notice they actually aren't quite symmetrical, which is kind of fun. I always think that's kind of cool because like everything in our body is so symmetrical sometimes. But like this is actually an example of asymmetry. You can see the left side is actually a little bit smaller. It's only got the one branch, whereas the right side is a little bit larger. And that's because your heart's apex actually kind of sits over to that left side. So it's taking up some of the space. So that's kind of cool, but not super important. But yeah, it kind of branches down into those two primary sections. And so, you know, if a molecule of oxygen was traveling down, it's kind of like taking a highway and then taking like, you know, an exit and going onto certain surface streets, right? Like it's going to branch down to here, and then it'll branch over here, and then it'll maybe go down here and then down here, right? And they'll just branch and branch and branch and branch and branch. And so, you know, the bronchi are the really, really big tubes, but you'll sometimes see these smaller tubes, and those smaller tubes are what we refer to as your bronchioles, okay? So your bronchioles are small branches that are breaking off from your primary bronchi. And those bronchioles end in these little weird, whoa, come on, camera. They end, I don't know what's going on, guys, sorry. End in these little popcorn-shaped sacs that we call alveoli, okay? And so alveoli, and I'll look up a picture of this so you guys can see a good picture, are these little kind of interesting looking little sacs that are at the end of all of your bronchioles, right? So a bronchi is like a big tube, a bronchiole is like a small tube, in the same way that like an artery was like a big tube and an arteriole was a small tube, or a vein was a big tube and an venule was a small tube. So bronchi to bronchioles, and then eventually they end in these little interestingly shaped sacs here. Like I said, they kind of look like popcorn. You know, so you can see like they're just covered in blood vessels, right? That is where, again, like your outside environment is being exposed to your inside environment, right? Like the inside of this tube here is technically not inside your body until the stuff that's in that tube passes into these tubes right here, these blood vessels. Once it passes into these blood vessels, well, now, you know, it's going to get picked up and it's going to travel, you know, this way, and then like this way and this way, and it's going to go through all those capillaries until it'll go, you know, into a venule, and then it'll eventually travel into a vein, and then eventually it'll get to the heart, and then the heart's going to pump it to wherever it needs to go, you know? And so those are the tubes where everything is kind of traveling through. Once our oxygen's in these tubes, now it is considered systemic. Now it's officially inside, you know, the inside part of your body there, right? Driving me insane. I can't handle this. This is gonna, hold on. I'm gonna do that. Suck it, camera. There we go. All right. Sorry, frustrating. So let's take a look at the other half of this anatomy here, right? So we've got the respiratory passageways. That's what's allowing a bulk flow of air to be able to travel. But then you also need to be able to create a pressure gradient inside your body to actually draw that air in, because again, oxygen will not move unless it is going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So how do we create, and here's all those tubes, by the way. There's your throat, that's your glottis and your epiglottis. Moving through that pretty quickly here because those are some pieces that don't really concern us. So then how the heck are we going to break everything and, create the process of like creating a low area of pressure so that like air is going to be like, oh my gosh, there's very little air over there. I want to go that way, right? How do we do that? Well, that's where your actual lungs come in, right? And so they don't have any contractile ability of their own. Your lungs are just these kind of empty sacs. They don't actually have the ability to, kind of squeeze or expand and create like pressure. They need the assistance of like outside forces in order to be able to do that. So luckily, your lungs are attached to this little muscle right here. This little dome, sort of looks like a dome-shaped muscle here, that is your diaphragm. When your diaphragm is relaxed, it kind of sits in a position like this. But when it contracts, rather than contracting kind of the way our muscles do, which is what most of our muscles do, which is like shortening and lengthening, this actually kind of flattens down like this. And that's what a contraction in your diaphragm looks like. And then it relaxes back to here, and it contracts back to here, and relaxes back to here. So what that does is when that flattens down, it's like grabbing the outside of a sack and pulling it open. That creates an area of low pressure, and that's why gas is going to rush into our lungs, right? Your respiratory passageways are the tubes that allow all that to happen, and all those tubes live in your actual lungs, and then your lungs are attached to your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle that is responsible for contracting, and that drives air into your lungs. Or when it relaxes and it goes back into dome shape, that pushes air out of your lungs, which is what's kind of funny because like when we think about like breathing, I had a hard time like believing this the first time I heard it, but it's like when it comes to breathing in is the active phase. That's the like concentric active contraction. Breathing out is actually like the passive part of breathing. That's the relaxation part of breathing. In the same way that like you would contract to raise a dumbbell and you would just relax to drop it. Breathing out is the dropping of a dumbbell. Like it's the lowering relaxation part. And I was like, that can't be right because we got like birthday candles and we go, like that. And like that's a very active thing. And it is, but what's interesting about that type of breathing is that actually uses secondary respiratory muscles that only get activated when you actually contract them. So like your abdominals are not really supposed to help with breathing. They can, but it's not really a big part of their job. Their job is to move your spine around. But when you need to like blow lots of pressure, yes, you can squeeze your abdominals, which squeezes your diaphragm, which flattens your diaphragm, draws your rib cage in, and all of those things contract your lungs, which yes, absolutely expels gas. But that is like an exception to the rule, and the rule is breathing in is very active, breathing out is very passive. So let's talk about breathing. Let's talk about that process of like breathing in and breathing out, right? So this is where we get into a little bit of a different definition. We got to kind of keep these definitions separate in our heads. Respiration is the process of moving gases, right? Like if we're moving a gas and we're diffusing it from one spot to another. But ventilation is the process of driving in gas, right? So like respiration is moving oxygen, ventilation is moving gas. And like I said, let's take a look at let's look at air here. Composition of air. This is actually what air looks like in terms of like its overall composition. You can see 78% of it is nitrogen. We don't breathe that. we don't get me wrong, we need nitrogen, but we get it from protein. But you know, that's 78% of the atmosphere. Only 21% of the atmosphere is actually oxygen. And then, you know, the rest of it is like carbon dioxide from animals like us breathing, and then like argon and neon and other gases. That's making up the remaining, like, you know, sort of 1 and 2% there. But, you know, for the most part, like most of the atmosphere, most of the gas that you drive into your lungs is actually nitrogen, but we respirate oxygen. So there is a slight difference between those definitions here, and that sometimes gets a little confusing. So inhalation and exhalation is the process of drawing air, and air is not just oxygen, into and out of the lungs. It's driving gases in, right? So inhalation is the active part of breathing, which includes drawing air into the lungs, right? So what happens is your diaphragm contracts, that draws your lungs open. When they're open, that creates an area of low pressure. Now there's a whole bunch of space in there. And so the atmosphere is like, yeah, I'm gonna move that way, right? It's like whenever you see a sci-fi movie, you know, think about how much space there is in space. It's a lot, right? So like when you're watching a sci-fi movie and they open the airlock and it's like, you see all the air like rushing out of the spaceship. That's because air is in a high concentration in the spaceship, and there's a very low concentration of air in space. So all that air wants to rush out of the ship. Same thing's happening in your lungs, you know? The diaphragm will contract and that draws the lungs open. Exhalation, totally the opposite, right? Exhalation is the passive part of breathing where your diaphragm relaxes back into this shape, or maybe like your rib cage relaxes back down and starts pressing into your lungs, right? But the diaphragm relaxes back to its dome shaped position. Now suddenly there's like a lot of pressure in your lungs, right? And so it's like the air that's in your lungs is like, I don't want to be here. There's lots of pressure. So then it moves into the atmosphere where there is less pressure. There's a lot of space out here. So that's kind of what that process looks like, right? You can see during a breath in, your diaphragm flattens down and pulls in this direction here, pulls downwards. And then your rib cage, your intercostal muscles, particularly your external intercostals, which are the little muscles that live between each of your ribs, they contract a little bit as well to like kind of open up your rib cage. And then your internal intercostals will contract to draw your rib cage down at the same time that your diaphragm relaxes back to shape. And so when your rib cage expands and when your diaphragm flattens down, that creates low pressure. So oxygen moves into your lungs. And when your diaphragm relaxes back and your intercostal muscles lower the rib cage back down, that creates an area of high pressure. And so one would draw air into your lungs and one would draw air out. So you can see like this picture's not, they should have just exaggerated a little bit more. These balloons kind of to me look the same, but you can see this balloon has more pressure in it over here. So like, that's why when you're blowing up a balloon, it gets harder and harder and harder to continue blowing more and more air into it. Because like here, you can see the concentration is pretty high, but then like, as we start to pump more and more oxygen in there, well, now the concentration's even higher, right? And so because there's such a high concentration in here, all that air wants to rush back to wherever there'd be a low concentration, you know, and that's why like sometimes it feels like it wants to kind of push back on you. So if we're talking about our lungs, we're talking about that concentration, right? We got to talk about like how our lungs are actually contracting and how much volume of gas is in our lungs at any given time. So this is where, when we're talking about lung volumes, I actually don't need you guys to have all of these memorized. Like they're all mentioned here, but honestly, there's only one of them that is the one that they may, even then, like, I don't think they'll ask you about it that much. But take a look right here. This is sort of representing the different volumes of air within our lungs, right? So let's say, like, picture how much, like, you know, if you were to like measure, like picture, let's say your lungs are no longer moving air. What if it was just like water, right? and you were able to like really easily like spit that water into a cup or something and then measure how much of it there is. Well, we can actually do that. We just do it with gases instead. So the normal like breath in that you guys are taking right now, I mean, I don't think any of you guys are like going on a jog right now. I think all you guys are probably pretty relaxed while you're listening to me. You are using what is called your tidal volume. All of you could go and take a bigger breath. All of you could go and exhale a bigger breath, right? But for the most part, you're kind of just breathing in naturally and breathing out naturally. That is what we refer to as your tidal volume. It's kind of like the tide, right? You know, you kind of get that normal wave coming in. It's pretty much the same size every time until you get like one of those big waves. It's like the 7th wave or something. You know, but that's, you know, for the most part, we call it the tidal volume because it's just a normal breath in and a normal breath out. So this is the amount of air that's moved into and out of your lungs during what we call quiet breathing, or, you know, normal breathing that you're doing right now. Now, obviously, there is way more room beyond like that normal breath in, right? Like, let's say you want to take a big deep breath in, right? So I'm using my tidal volume right now while I'm explaining this. But then if I want to go and drive a whole bunch of air in, eventually I'm going to get to a maximum. The area between those two is what is known as your inspiratory reserve volume. Remember, inspiration is breathing in, that's inhalation. So that's my inspiratory reserve. And then if I wanted to exhale beyond my normal, like quiet breathing out, like, you know, right now, let's say I breathe out. And then let's say I want to go even further. That would be my expiratory reserve. So the area between those two is referred to as your vital capacity. Your vital capacity is like this idea that it's like, hey, it's the maximum and the maximum, you know, it's as much gas as it's possible. If you were in the middle of a sprint, you know, and like you were breathing absolutely as hard as you can, drawing as much air as possible and exhaling as much air as possible. Now, because you are not exactly perfect at getting rid of everything, there is one other little volume here, which this is the very much the least important. And that's what's called your residual volume. And that's like the space that we can't really tap into. You know, like think about like if you took a paper sack and you crumpled it up, we know there's still a little bit of space left in that sack, right? But like for the most part, it's like I can't get any more space out. At least I can't, like with my, you know, if I were to put it on like a what are those videos they have on YouTube where people have like the hydraulic presses? You know, you guys ever watch those? It's like they're meant to be like satisfying videos of like it looks like a garden gnome and they'll flatten it, or like you know, they just use that hydraulic press. Yeah, if you were to use that, sure, you would get rid of there'd be no volume left in that empty sack. But if you and I were to just kind of crumple something up, there's still like little bits of space left in there. That's kind of how your lungs are. That's your residual volume. And it's really not something that ever comes up in conversation. You know, don't get me wrong, like your tidal volume and your inspiratory reserve and your expiratory reserve, those are things that we do pay attention to in sort of the medical world of things. You know, like for instance, if you have like COPD, right? Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, right? It is literally where there is like tar and crap in your lungs, right? And so that is going to make your lungs stickier. It's going to mean that you've filled this empty sack with some stuff. And now that's going to make it very, very difficult for gas to be able to move in. So if I were to like, you know, let's say take this glass right here and I filled it with sand to here, and I'm measuring how much water I can fill, there's going to be less water that I can fit in the glass, right? That's exactly what smoking does to us. And this is why, like, all of us should, for them, you know, really be against smoking. This is something we are trying to get our clients to avoid because we know that we all need to be able to drive in massive amounts of oxygen. And when I say all versions of smoking, I mean, you just should not put anything into your lungs. And when I say anything, I really do mean anything. And I know that it's 2021. I know we live in California, and there are other versions of smoking out there that are becoming, you know, legal, and they should be, and that's fine. But just from a biologic standpoint, don't put stuff into this system. It doesn't belong. I love camping. Campfires are bad for us. They are. They just like this inhaling little bits of wood. They're gonna get stuck in the like. It's a wet, sticky environment. If you're gonna do that stuff, do it. You know, put it through your digestive system. Way safer. Way, 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 way safer. You know, and that's true of like chemicals and other stuff as well. You know, even if you were to consume, I don't know, for something not healthy, you know, like a virus or a bacteria or something, you know, you get it into your digestive system, you get stomach acid that for the most part will destroy most things, part of your immune system, you know. It's a way safer system to take stuff through. Not a fan of bringing stuff through the respiratory system, ever, 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 ever. I could just keep doing that all day. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this gradient. We've kind of already talked about it, but let's talk about this exchange gradient here, right? Gas exchange, it requires a pressure gradient in the same way that like fluid exchange would require like a pressure gradient, right? So how do we create that pressure gradient? Remember, like I said, if you want to understand this universe that we live in, you want to understand this wonderful world, two primary rules. Form, function follows form, right? And nature hates a gradient. Stuff will always move from lots of stuff to little stuff, right? And not making a political statement here, but nature is a socialist. Nature wants to move it from where there's some, you know, a lot of it to where everybody is an equal amount, right? That's areas of high to areas of low. It's Robin Hood, you know? So it is nature, things will naturally move down their pressure gradient, or they will move down their concentration gradient. So there's actually two types of gradients that are happening here in your lungs, right? There's a pressure gradient where there's like lots of gas to very little gas, right? But there's also a concentration gradient, lots of oxygen to very little oxygen. So we're taking advantage of both of these actually. When it comes to external exchange, oxygen levels in your lungs are really, really high. You know, you think about like driving all this air in, and now there's like, you're in this sack, and there's all these oxygen molecules. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall where your blood cells are, your blood cells sitting over there like, well, I don't have any oxygen in me, right? And so oxygen's like, oh, you don't have any oxygen. And so it naturally moves into that red blood cell, right? It will move from high concentration to low concentration. There's a low concentration of oxygen in the blood cell, so oxygen naturally moves in there. That's a concentration gradient, in the same way that we had a pressure gradient that moved the gas in there. And then meanwhile, CO2 does exactly the opposite, right? In your lungs, in the chamber, there's very little CO2 because you filled it mostly with oxygen. So the concentration of CO2 is really, really low. Remember, look at our atmosphere, right? You know, like I said, only like 0.04% of it is CO2. You know, look at this thing. Like, oh, hold on. Yeah. Where's the one I pulled up a second ago? Ah, there it is. 0.03% of it is CO2. Very. So if we draw a bunch of gas into our lungs, the concentration of CO2 is pretty freaking low. And the concentration of CO2 in your blood cells is really, really high. So then all that CO2 moves out of your blood cells because it's moving from high concentration to low concentration. Nature hates gradients. So that's happening at the external exchange. And then the exact flip of that happens at the internal exchange, right? Once we get to our body's tissue level, right? That oxygen, that red blood cell travels to my bicep or whatever, right? It is going to go, hey, I've got all this oxygen. I got a high concentration of oxygen within this red blood cell. And then the tissue's like, well, I don't have any oxygen. I have a bunch of CO2. And so the oxygen rushes this way and the CO2 rushes this way, from high concentration to low concentration, from high concentration to low concentration, right? So they exchange with each other. And that's the internal versus the external exchange. And we can see that picture here, right? You can see the concentration of oxygen is really high and the concentration of oxygen is really low. This is in the lungs, right? So oxygen moves in, CO2 moves out. And then the exact opposite is true. Look, there's a bunch of CO2 over here, so it wants to go this way. There's a bunch of oxygen over here, it wants to go this way. And that's where, like, you know, both of these need to be, this is why your alveoli and all of your body tissues have to be covered in those capillary beds that we talked about yesterday when we were talking about the cardiovascular system, right? Those capillary beds cover our tissues to allow for this exposure to occur. Last little thing we're going to look at when it comes to transporting oxygen, like I said, your body does use iron to actually do this. That's actually why your blood cells are so good at carrying oxygen. There's actually a couple things going on here. If we look at a red blood cell, it's called an erythrocyte. You know, they're kind of cool looking. They look like little filled in donuts, you know. It's so funny when I talk about lungs and when I talk about the respiratory system, I talk about donuts a lot because you're a human donut. But then also, like, this also kind of looks like a donut, and it's like, we got to get some donuts. I used to do donuts at the end of every month when we graduated, but we don't get to meet that often anymore. But here we go, right? Here is our sort of concentration of an erythrocyte, right? Here's sort of what the erythrocyte looks like. They're these little kind of filled in donuts. The reason they have that shape actually is because they kind of look like this at first. You know, originally they look like a regular old, you know, cell, like a big animal cell that's, you know, this kind of big empty squishy sac. And then it actually has organelles in it. It has mitochondria, it has lysosomes, it has all the normal stuff you're going to see inside of a cell. But what's cool about red blood cells is they actually eject all of those pieces before they enter the actual bloodstream. So once they like sort of enter the, you know, once they sort of enter the world, right? Originally they'll look like this. They're really big. They got a nucleus. They got, you know, mitochondria, got all this stuff, right? And then they kind of go through their little evolutionary process, and then they'll spit everything out. They actually eject their nucleus so that it can be used in the next red blood cell. And when that happens, it sort of collapses in on itself into this little donut shape here, right? So it was like a big circle, and then it's like a deflated basketball, you know? And that's really, that actually, that little disc shape makes it really good at carrying oxygen. And it also makes it really good at squeezing through blood vessels. We need to have like pressure, right? And so sometimes like a blood cell will hit like a tube that it can't get through, and then it will fold and actually pop through to the other side. And that creates a little bit of pressure and makes it move a lot faster. It's literally like, and then it kind of goes flying out, right? That creates a little bit of pressure, which also helps us move blood around. So that's what's kind of funny. Sometimes those blood vessels, those capillaries, are smaller than the red blood cells. It's like the tube that's traveling is smaller than the thing that's traveling through the tube, and that creates, like I said, like creates pressure. So within an erythrocyte, you are going to have this specialized protein. Okay, and that specialized protein is called hemoglobin. So heme actually comes from the word that means iron, I think. Hold on one sec. Okay, no, it's not. The origin is not hemoglobin. There's no way. Derived from the Greek word, okay, just means blood. Okay. So I guess heme means blood, but globin is oxygen. So this is like the protein that carries oxygen within the blood. Okay. So that's what hemoglobin is. Hemoglobin is this protein that we all have make, and it's a specialized protein found in red blood cells, and it has a molecule of iron at its center. And so if I look at if I show, pull up a picture of hemoglobin, and we look at the picture here, this is actually what hemoglobin looks like. It's this really complicated, weird looking protein, but it's actually kind of got 4 separate sections to it. And there's a molecule of iron at the center of each of those sections, right? And like I said, iron is really attracted to oxygen. You guys have actually seen this plenty of times throughout your life. If you've ever seen something that is like rusty, the reason something, you know, it kind of looks like the reason rust is sort of this sort of bright red color there is because that's what happens when oxygen binds to iron. So this is a chain that is like full of iron. There's actually a picture right next to it. This one right here. See how like it's, you know, very red, but then like see these little bits here that are turning kind of bluish or like kind of greenish, right? That means that there are some other metals mixed in with that iron. That's probably like there's a little bit of copper or maybe like zinc that's in there. So we use iron in our blood to attract oxygen to our red blood cells. And we do that with this specialized protein called hemoglobin. This is why you'll sometimes hear about people who are like anemic. If you're anemic, your body is not producing enough hemoglobin. So then your red blood cells are not quite good enough at carrying oxygen around the body, which is why people who are anemic will often feel nauseous. They'll have low energy levels, and they'll just feel like they can't concentrate or that they can't like, you know, go throughout their day. And that's because their brain cells aren't getting enough oxygen, their body's muscles are not getting enough oxygen. Everything is just kind of, you know, we're not moving oxygen around very effectively. And so it makes you feel really off balance, makes you feel really bad. And so that's why, like, and usually it's women who are going to experience this, will often need to take like iron as like a supplement. And make sure that we're getting plenty of iron in our blood. Or you'll see it in like certain like diets, like really low calorie diets, vegetarian diets sometimes. Although there's plenty of ways to get iron in a vegetarian diet, you know, stuff like that. So when we're transporting oxygen, we do it with this specialized protein called hemoglobin. By the way, there are other types of globin out there in the universe, which is kind of cool. There is, I can never remember the name of it, but cyaninoglobin. That's not actually what it is. Cyanoglobin, that's what it is. There's actually other animals out there that use other metals. So for instance, like certain like squids and spiders and starfish, they actually use cyanoglobin, which is like, it uses copper instead of iron to bind oxygen and carry oxygen around, because oxygen is also fairly attracted to copper. And so they have blue blood. And then there's green blood and there's violet blood out there. There's actually like lots of colors of blood out there, but we use hemoglobin, we use iron, and that's why our blood is red. And that's why the Statue of Liberty is kind of a greenish color, because it's mostly made up of copper. And so when oxygen binds to iron, it turns red. When oxygen binds to copper, it turns blue. And that's why starfish have blue blood. They use oxygen, or they use copper. And then we also need to transport carbon dioxide around. Carbon dioxide, you know, some of it is dissolved in the plasma of your blood itself. Plasma is the fluid portion. Some of it is combined with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin can also carry CO2 as well. It's also, because CO2 is carbon dioxide, so it's actually a little bit of carbon and then 2 oxygen molecules. There's still oxygen in there, so iron is attracted to that, you know. And then some of it is actually just dissolved in the fluids of your blood, and we call that bicarbonate, where there's actually a little bit of extra sort of two carbon molecules there, and that just kind of moves around passively in the fluids of your blood as well. This is why when you are sort of dehydrated, your acidity level actually climbs. It's because you have way too much CO2 in your blood, and that's one of the reasons why it's very important to stay hydrated every day. So all of this respiration stuff is under the control of your autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic system, you know, the stuff that you don't have to think about, is responsible for saying, yeah, we need to breathe more, right? And it will start to naturally cause you to start to, like, you know, breathe in certain ways. And that's where sometimes people will experience what we call like a panic attack, right? Sometimes you'll see people who are hyperventilating. Hyperventilation, it feels like you can't get enough oxygen. And that's because at a cellular level, you're actually not. But what's weird about hyperventilation is that it's actually not from a lack of oxygen entering your lungs. It is actually from a lack of CO2 in your blood. And that seems really weird, because it's like, why would a low amount, I thought CO2 is what I'm getting rid of, right? Why would I need CO2? Well, remember, you need to create a gradient. So we need to have like a little bit of CO2 in an area because that's going to create an area of low concentration, which is going to cause oxygen to actually move. And we need to have an area of oxygen, which is going to cause like CO2 to move. So when someone's having a panic attack, if anybody in here has ever been around someone who's hyperventilating, what you can do to help them is have them breathe into like a paper bag. And what that does is whenever they exhale and they exhale some CO2, it gets trapped in the bag. And then when they inhale, it actually reintroduces some of that CO2 back into their lungs. And so if you do it over and over and over again, you will restore your CO2 levels back to normal, which will allow you to start moving oxygen the way that you're supposed to. So if you ever have a client hyperventilate, you'll know what to do. Go get a paper sack and have them breathe into that. However, it actually doesn't happen very often during exercise because you produce a lot of CO2 when you're exercising. So it's actually not that common. But all of this, like I said, is under the control of your autonomic nervous system. You've got motor neurons, which are extending to the spinal cord, which are going to, extend to your diaphragm, which are going to cause that to contract. So your brain is going to go, man, our blood is acidic. We have a lot of CO2. We need some oxygen, right? So it's going to travel down, and that's going to cause the diaphragm to kind of pick up its pace and match your heart rate, right? And those two are both kind of working together at the same time. So you've got these chemical receptors, chemoreceptors, that are responding to either how much oxygen's in your blood or how much CO2. They're there to taste basically how much oxygen. And if it's like, man, there's not enough oxygen in the blood right now, it will cause you to start breathing a little bit faster. Now, like I said, there are like abnormal versions. There's hyperventilation, right? That's hypocapnic, lack of CO2. There's hypoventilation, which is that's insufficient air. Hypoventilation is where you are suffocating. That's also very bad. But both of these do different things to your pH, right? Hyperventilation, where you don't have enough CO2, increases your blood's pH. Whereas hypoventilation decreases your blood's pH. And that's it for the lungs by themselves. Any questions, comments, or concerns? Uh-oh, lost Gabriel. Any questions, guys?
No.
Thomas is feeling good. Derek, Bay, Lorianne, you guys feeling good? Thumbs up.
Good.
My God, Derek, your microphone's working.
About time.
Good to have you. All right. Cool. All right. Well, let's take a look at the next PowerPoint. So let's put it together, right? Let's take today's lesson and let's combine it. Where did it go? Combine it with yesterday's lesson. So you can see, obviously, it's sort of a different brand of slides here. These are NASM slides. So they wrote these, not the Memler's textbook. So this is going to be chapter 3 within your NASM textbook, not chapter 3 within your Memler. So when you're following up, that is where this information is going to come from. And like I said, treat this as sort of like the filter. We just gave you a whole bunch of information, extra information, if we're being honest, for the last 2 days on the cardiovascular system, and we gave you extra information on the respiratory system. Now we can kind of filter that down and say, okay, well, here's the important parts that, yeah, this is what's probably going to be on your actual NASM exam. So you can see it's only 24 slides. It's definitely a little bit more compact. So let's get Gabriel back in here. Wait for it. There it is. What's up, man?
I'm back, yeah.
Don't sweat it. Happened, trust, you haven't experienced this yet. Derek, you either. At some point, my internet will go down. Like, it has happened a few times where I'm like, stand by.
I was like, damn, my whole device died.
Yeah, it happens. But I was talking to somebody about this the other day. Like, the world was not ready for the entire world to switch to Zoom. Like, we did not have the internet infrastructure in place to deal with everyone working from home. It's getting better now, but do you guys remember how slow, like, I couldn't like watch YouTube the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. That was wild. Anyway, let's take a look at the cardiorespiratory system. So let's put yesterday's info with today's info, filter it down, and get the most important pieces. So purpose of today's second PowerPoint is to provide you guys with a fundamental knowledge and explanation of the cardiorespiratory system, which is cardiovascular and respiratory sort of working together. Our objectives today are to understand, so we are going to review the cardiorespiratory system. We are going to review the cardiovascular system. We're going to review very briefly the respiratory system, even though we just talked about it. And then we're going to put them together in the cardiorespiratory system. We'll talk about how each of them are related to like human movement. We can't move without, you know, being able to deliver oxygen and stuff. Talk a little bit about oxygen testing procedures and how that is related to energy expenditure. So, looking at the cardiorespiratory system, it is a support system in the body, meaning that it supports human movement for providing tissues of the human body with oxygen, nutrients, protective agents, and a means to remove waste products, right? So this is where, yeah, your cardio, you know, you think about like, we are bringing oxygen in, that's your respiratory system, right? But we're also like moving around proteins, fats, and carbs from our digestive system. That's the cardiovascular side of things. We've got protective agents in our blood. That's your immune system. And then we are removing CO2 from the body, right? So that's where your blood and your lungs are really working together. And then your heart is kind of powering the whole thing. And then your blood vessels are allowing everything to be able to kind of transport around and travel, you know? So it is consisting of the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system working together. So like I said yesterday, the cardiovascular system, this is your heart. It is all of your blood, and it is all of the blood vessels. You can see they drew some of the major arteries here, right? So heart, blood, and blood vessels is the cardiovascular system. The heart is this muscular pump that is very good at contracting, and that drives blood throughout the body, right? So this is, like I said, it's kind of powering your entire cardiovascular system. Your heart itself is made up of cardiac cells or cardiac muscle. And cardiac muscle is very good at rhythmically contracting, generating areas of high pressure, which are going to move fluids away from that area to an area of low pressure. And so you can see we've got all these little chambers in here that are allowing those contractions to take place. So cardiac muscle is going to be involuntary. It is under the control of your nervous system, but you do not have conscious control over it, right? And so it sort of has a built-in rhythm of about 70 to 80 beats per minute, right? On average. And you guys might be thinking like, that that sounds a little bit high, actually. 70 to 80 beats per minute. Like right now, you know, yeah, I'm being like pretty active and animated like while I'm talking, and I'm sitting right around like 71 beats per minute right now. And so like you might be thinking it's like, well, when I'm resting, like my heart rate's much lower than 70. Yeah, that's true. That's your resting heart rate. And this is a group full of people who are all studying to become like personal trainers. So you got strong hearts, you know, like that's a pretty common thing, actually. If your resting heart rate is below 70 to 80 in our demographic, it's actually pretty normal. But typically you'll see most people, it's around 70 to 80. Any higher than that, that kind of shows us that we have sort of an inefficient heart that has to pump more often to get the same amount of work done. So there is sort of a built-in rhythm in that cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is really good at contracting. We look at some of the specialized structures of it. Cardiac muscles are a little bit shorter and they're really tightly compact together. That is what makes it so good at, like, when one fiber contracts, it kind of drags the other fiber with it. And it also makes it very easy for electricity to be able to jump from cell to cell to cell to cell and move across everything really, really rapidly. Now, there is actually a conduction system. We can see that in this picture here, actually, that runs throughout the cell itself, right? That conduction system is what allows an electric signal to contract all of the fibers of the heart at this specific rhythm. And so it's going to start with this little node right here called your SA node, or your sinoatrial node. That is the pacemaker of the heart that determines your actual heart's rhythm. And then that signal is going to run across the top of the heart first. And so that's why the top of the heart is going to contract first. And when you look at a heartbeat, it doesn't just all contract at the it doesn't just all contract at the same time. You'll notice it kind of squeezes from top to bottom, right? Top, bottom, bump, bump, lub dub, you know? And so that's because the sinoatrial node kicks off the signal, and then there's a direct wire that runs along the top of the heart. But then that signal travels down to this little node right here. That's called your AV node. That's what's known as your atrioventricular node. And that delays the signal and allows the top of the heart to finish contracting before the signal continues traveling down to the rest of the heart. And then it will travel down to here into this little bundle called the bundle of His. And then that will branch down into what are called your Purkinje fibers, which allow the rest of the heart to really get that big signal. So the sinoatrial node is located in the right atrium of the heart. It lives in that right atrium's chamber, and it is the pacemaker of the heart. It determines the actual rhythm. So that's what's connected to your nervous system. When your nervous system says, hey, speed up or slow down, the sinoatrial node is what's listening. Then you do have all those internodal pathways that lead to your AV node, and then eventually that leads to the bundles and Purkinje fibers and stuff. But like I said, you'll notice the only thing that made it into our notes is the SA node. So that's probably the only thing you're actually going to be tested on if they decide to even ask you that. Remember, you're only going to have about 20 questions related to, all of chapter 2 and chapter 3. So, not everything's going to be on your test. So within your heart, we do have a bunch of different chambers here. We want to understand those chambers so that we know how blood is flowing through the heart. You are going to split this up. We split this up a little bit differently. Yesterday when we were doing cardiovascular system, we split it into the left side of the heart and then the right side of the heart. This time, we're dividing it into top of the heart, bottom of the heart. So just to look at it in a slightly different way. But each side of the heart, right? It's kind of these 4 big chambers here. You've got the atriums on top and the ventricles down below. So the atriums, or atria, which is the real plural, are the chambers of the heart that gather blood as it returns to the heart, right? So you've got your right atrium over here that gathers blood that is low in oxygen. This is blood that's returning from the body. So it just got back from your calf muscles, right? And now it needs to drop off, it needs to get to the lungs so it can get rid of its CO2. So it doesn't have any oxygen in it. That's low oxygen blood. That's why we're drawing this side in blue. And so then it's going to go from that right atrium over into the right ventricle and get pumped to the lungs. On the flip side of things, on the other side of the top of the heart, you can see we've got our left atrium. The left atrium is gathering blood that's high in oxygen. This is blood that's coming right back from the lungs. So because it was just in the lungs, it has an ish ton of oxygen in it. And so now it's going to be able to deliver that where it needs to go. So that's the top of the heart. The bottom of the heart are your ventricles. They're in charge of pumping blood out of the heart. So your atrium's gathering blood as it returns, but the ventricles are ejecting that blood out of the heart. So the right ventricle which is attached to the right atrium, is ejecting low oxygen blood over to the lungs so that we can turn it into high oxygen blood. And the left ventricle is ejecting blood out, that's blood that's high in oxygen out to the various tissues of the body to ensure that they get sufficient oxygen. Okay, so those are sort of the chambers there. So if we track a red blood cell, it's going to go from right atrium to right ventricle over to the lungs, pick up some oxygen, go to the left atrium, into the left ventricle, and get ejected out up to, let's say, the brain, drop off that oxygen. Now it's low oxygen blood, and that process is going to repeat. It's sort of a double figure 8, right? From heart to blood, blah, from heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body. So if we are measuring how well this is working, just like we talked about yesterday, we are going to measure the function of your heart in 2 ways. All right, we're going to measure how much blood is ejected from your heart per beat and how many times your heart can beat per, and we use minutes, right? So the amount of blood that your heart can pump per beat, that is known as your stroke volume. That is the volume of blood pushed through your heart or pushed through your body every time your heart squeezes. Your heart rate is how often that is happening. So then we have the overall performance of your heart, which is consisting of how much blood, that's stroke volume, is pumped per minute, that's heart rate. So the formula for cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. So if you are ejecting 10 units of blood, let's say I need let's say I need 100 units of blood, right? I need a cardiac output of 100 in order to be able to supply me to do whatever it is that I'm doing. I'm going on a run, right? I need 100 units of blood per minute. Okay, so if my stroke volume is 10, right, then I need to beat my heart 10 times in order for that to happen. So if this is representing your heart, your stroke volume, and this is representing your heart rate. Not as fast as I'd like to be. This is your cardiac output. Okay, and that's not bad. But what if my heart is way stronger? What if I am able to, instead of ejecting 10 units of blood every time my heart beats, what if I'm able to eject 15 units of blood every time my heart beats, right? Well, now, if my heart beats 10 times, that means that my cardiac output is going to be 150. So I've raised my cardiac output, which means my heart is better at delivering oxygen, right? Or, maybe my heart rate's like, great, you're delivering that much oxygen every single beat. I don't have to beat that often, right? So let's say my stroke volume is 20. That'll make my math a lot easier. So if my stroke volume is 20 and I'm able to deliver double the amount of blood per beat, what's going to happen? My heart's going to beat less, right? Instead of beating 10 times, it's going to beat 5 times. And that means that my cardiac output will still be 100, but now my stroke volume is so much higher that my heart rate is able to be lower, even though I'm getting the same cardiac output. So what that draws us to the conclusion of, right, if we're paying attention to this, is that the lower your heart rate is, the better in shape your heart is functioning. And that's why we have fitness assessments that are actually paying attention to what someone's heart rate is. Again, if I were to put myself through a 3-minute step test, right? So the 3-minute step test, some of you guys will remember, It's where there's a 12-inch step, and I step onto it for 3 minutes straight at a pace about like this: left, right, up, up, down, down. I just keep that up for 3 minutes straight, and then I turn around and I sit and I test what my heart rate is for the next 1 minute, and I'm like, bump, bump. My heart rate at first, I just got done doing it, so it's pretty fast, and then it starts to slow down a little bit because I'm not doing any work. I'm sitting on the bench, right? Sitting on the step. So my heart rate starts to come down. Let's say I tested it for a full minute and the heart rate was 150 beats by the end. Well, I'm going to say, okay, well, it was 150 beats. Let's say I start working out. I write that number down. I keep it, keep a log of it. And then 6 weeks later, I've been doing my cardio. I've been going on my runs. I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do. And I'm like, I'm going to see how much stronger my heart is. And I do the exact same pace on the step. I do the exact same height of the step. And I do it for 3 minutes, just like I did last time. And then I turn around and I sit. And now, instead of 150 beats like it was last time, my heart rate at the end was only 125 beats. That shows me that the cardio routine that I've been on is working. It's making my heart stronger because I got the same amount of work done in less heartbeats. And my heart is now recovering much faster than it was before. Make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Cool. Now, when it comes to measuring your pulse, you do want to pay attention to this. There's a lot of different versions of pulse that we use. Like we've got target heart rates. That's where so Derek, I would calculate what numbers I want you to hit. And I'd be like, all right, Derek, I want you to be at 120 for this many minutes, right? That's target heart rate. There's resting heart rate, which is what your heart rate is when you're at rest. But no matter what it is, the way we're going to measure it, generally NASM is going to recommend using your radial pulse. That's right here on the wrist. 2 fingers in line with your thumb and index finger just above the wrist, right about there. And so that's where you're going to measure your pulse. If you have a hard time seeing that, sometimes people have like a really huge freaking tendon there. If that's the case, you can always do your carotid instead. I'm on the wrong side. It should be this side, which would be right here. And you can always do that version as well. 2 fingers just along this artery here. But NASM is going to recommend the radial pulse here in the wrist. And the way you're going to do this, if you're mid-workout, it's pretty awkward. Like if you're jogging, trying to do this freaking thing, or like, it's not exactly convenient, right? So you're only going to want to measure it for as short as possible. So go for about 6 seconds and then just add a 0. 6 times 10, that's 60 seconds, right? And that's what we're trying to get. We measure our pulse in beats per minute, not per 30 seconds, not per 2 minutes, that'd be ridiculous. We measure it in beats per minute, right? Because that's an easy version of us to kind of have like a standard and pay attention to, right? So ideally, you would do that for about 6 seconds and multiply by 10 if you're in the middle of a workout. Now, if you're sitting down, your client's like resting and you're trying to get like a true version of their resting heart rate and you have the time and you want to do it, measure it for a full minute. You can do a full 60 seconds, just count the whole thing. There's nothing wrong with that. Or maybe you go 30 seconds and you multiply it by 2. Just whatever you do, make sure you get it to a 60-second number because that's the beats per minute. Now, we kind of skimmed over blood pretty quickly yesterday, but blood, obviously, very important. That is the medium that's actually delivering all these materials. And that's the second component of our cardiovascular system, right? You got roughly about 5 liters of blood in your body. It's about 1.5 gallons, which is why, if you ever hear somebody say, it's like, oh, I donated like a gallon of blood yesterday. And it's like, you would be super dead. But yeah, you get about 5 liters worth. And this is the material inside of our body. It's actually considered liquid connective tissue, which is weird because it does have the ability to clot. But it's able to transport oxygen, it transports hormones, it allows nutrients to get where they're going, and it helps us remove waste products like CO2 so that we don't become, so we don't raise our pH too high. It also helps us regulate body temperature, which is nice, for instance, my air conditioning is blowing on the back of my neck right now. This is real freaking cold, but the rest of me is fine, right? And luckily, like, my body is probably moving warm blood back this way to kind of balance everything out. But that's part of what your blood's job as well. And then it also has like specialized immune cells in it that are, killing any foreign invaders. But the ones that we're going to spend most of our time talking about are our erythrocytes. Those are your red blood cells. These are specialized cells that contain a protein in them called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has a molecule of iron at the center of each of its little sections there. And that iron is what binds to oxygen to allow for red blood cells to be really good at transporting oxygen around the body. And so and the air conditioning goes off, thank God. That's what our red blood cells do. Then we've got, that's really great timing. Thanks, house. Then we have got our blood vessels. Your blood vessels are the tubes by which all of those red blood cells are actually traveling around. And this is a closed circuit. There's no open sections. If this was like, let's say you like cut this right here, right? You ruptured this. Well, now there's like, look at how much white space is in this drawing here. That's where blood's going to flow, right? Blood's going to go to the area of low pressure, and there's very little blood in all this empty white space, right? All of our blood is kind of trapped within these tubes here. That's why it needs to be a closed circuit. And so that closed circuit allows a blood cell to be able to travel around to the various tissues of the body, depending on where it's going. So when we're labeling these blood vessels, we are going to label them as arteries. Those are the blood vessels that are transporting blood away from the heart. We've got veins, which are carrying blood back towards the heart. And then the area in the middle, which you can see this picture is kind of drawing it as like purple, sort of in the middle, form these like beds that absolutely cover our tissues, and we call those capillary beds, right? So earlier, and so that's sort of what that looks like, right? And they'll just absolutely cover whatever tissue. Like, let's say this is like, muscle tissue, right? These are cells, right? Muscle tissue is going to be covered in capillaries, right? But the same thing is true with the lungs, right? Remember, if we were looking at alveoli, they are covered in capillaries around the outside, right? And so oxygen would travel down this little tube. You can see this is sort of what the inside of that tube looks like. There's all these little oxygen molecules in there. And oxygen is so freaking small that it is able to actually pass through the walls into these little capillary beds. And that's where they become exposed to our red blood cells. Pretty small, all of this stuff, isn't it? Yeah, pretty freaking tiny. So capillaries are very much microscopic. Like you can see, if you look at the body's exhibit, you can see some blood vessels, but that's not even very accurate. Like this is real small and stuff, but like it gets, the microscopic ones, you can't see those. Like there are more blood vessels than even what we're seeing in this picture here, covering our tissues. Pretty freaking amazing. By the way, there's what the inside of your lungs look like. It's not red and blue, by the way. I don't know why they're coloring them, but that's sort of what the bronchi and all the little like bronchioles look like. And then they would end in, like I said, they'd be microscopic, but there'd be all these little popcorn shaped things looking at the end. And there's where the heart is sort of situated, in between. Again, I don't know why they're doing it in red and blue there. It's not like you have like a deoxygenated lung and an oxygen. That's not how that works. So anyway, so that's your cardiovascular system review from yesterday. Those are the most important concepts. We did have a lot of information yesterday. The important stuff though is what's in this second half of notes here. We just did a lot of notes on respiratory system. Let's talk about the important stuff. So the important stuff, by definition, that's an important one, right? Respiratory system. It is a system that works very intimately with your cardiovascular system, and it provides a means by which to collect oxygen from the environment and get it exposed to our cells, right? And exposed to our bloodstream. So this allows for proper cellular functioning. And it's made up of two primary things. One is your respiratory pump. Your respiratory pump is located in the thoracic cavity. You can see that right here, right? That's the diaphragm. And then it would be your rib cage and the intercostal muscles and things like that. So located in the thoracic cavity, it provides the framework and the flexibility to allow for the expansion and compression, which allows ventilation, moving of gas, to occur. This consists of bones like your sternum, your ribs, your vertebrae. All of those things kind of push your lungs back down to, when you're relaxing, to push air out. But it also consists of muscles like your diaphragm, your external and your internal intercostals, which live between your ribs. Even your scalenes, which are little neck muscles here, your sternocleidomastoid, which is my favorite muscle. That's this big thick muscle right here. Your pec minor, which is the little fiber that lives underneath your big pec muscles, and even your abdominals. They are there to help. Now, I mentioned a lot of muscles here, but of those muscles, you have primary respiratory muscles and you have secondary respiratory muscles. And we're not breaking those down today, but they become very, very important later. Primary respiratory muscles, they have one job: to respirate. Secondary respiratory muscles often have other jobs. They move our bones around. They are often skeletal muscle that do certain things. So for instance, your sternocleidomastoid, right, the one on your neck, it does help you breathe a little bit. It can pull your rib cage up like this. It can help you breathe a little. But when it also is in charge of posture. So it also draws your neck forward like this. So if you breathe with that instead of breathing with your diaphragm, you are breathing with a thing that is also a posture muscle. So guess what? It can screw up your posture. And that's why we call them secondary respiratory muscles. Ideally, we won't use them, except for when we're in the middle of like, like crazy intense breathing because you're sprinting up a hill or something, right? And so you think about like your trap muscles, right? Your upper trapezius muscles right in here. That's part of your scalenes complex, right? That also elevates your shoulders. So if you're breathing like this all day, because you're stressed out, or maybe you're working at a desk job or something like that, well, now the process of breathing is screwing up your posture, which might give you shoulder impingement. It might give you weakened muscles. It starts to lead to like problems. Or maybe your bad posture, on the reverse of that, starts affecting your ability to breathe properly. So you start to get tension headaches and things like that. And this is why it's so important for us to analyze our client's posture, which we'll talk about next mod when we talk about kinesiology. Your respiratory system and your posture are actually intimately connected to one another. So that's your respiratory pump. And then we've also got our respiratory passageways. These are the passageways that funnel air, into and out of the lungs, right? So you've got your nose and your oral cavities. They're, basically going to be like the first areas where, air is going to travel in, and then it's going to travel down your trachea, and then that will branch into your bronchi. And then the bronchi are going to branch into bronchioles, and then all of those are going to end in the ending section, which is going to be your alveoli and alveolar sacs, right? Those little popcorn shaped sacs that, like I said, are covered in blood vessels. So your cardiovascular system works very intimately with your respiratory system. That's why we call it the cardiorespiratory system, right? It's both those two coming together. And so this is providing a means by which to gather oxygen from the environment, that's the respiratory system part, and transfer it throughout the body, that's the cardiovascular part. So the amount of oxygen that you are generally moving per minute is about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen. So, if you would have filled this glass up with 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. So all of us use about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen for however many kilograms of body weight we all have. For me, was that 87? What? How much do I weigh? Hold on. 81. So I'm about 81 kilograms, right? So that would be 81 times 3.5. So I'm consuming about 283.5 milliliters of oxygen per minute when I am at rest. So when I am sleeping, that's how much I'm consuming. Right now, I'm not sleeping, I'm sitting upright. But that's, in terms of if you were to, chart out the energy expenditure, like me sleeping versus me sprinting as absolutely hard as I can, working as much muscle, working as absolutely hard as possible, everything on that is like a different scale. So if I am, consuming, if you were to like hook me up to a machine and say, hey, you are currently consuming 567 milliliters of oxygen per minute, you know that I am at 2 METs worth of energy, meaning I am consuming twice as much oxygen as I would be as if I were sleeping, or I am burning twice as many calories as I would be if I were sleeping. So that's one of the ways that we can measure this. So we call that a MET. One MET is 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. We sometimes call it, that's known as a metabolic equivalent, okay? Now, here's the thing. METs are pretty helpful if you are really running some super sophisticated, super sophisticated math to determine like how much you as an athlete would need in terms of like energy and stuff. So like if you were like cycling the Tour de France, for instance, this several day event where, I need to make sure that you never get out of breath. Otherwise, you're going to have to slow down during the race. I want to get you, just to this perfect level where you're able to work hard enough, but continuously and not have to slow down. I'm going to measure your METs. I'm going to measure how much you weigh, how much oxygen you're bringing in, how many calories I'm giving you, right? And I'm going to measure like all of that. And we're going to say, all right, man, like you're going to be at this many METs when you're traveling, let's say 16, 17 miles per hour, right? I don't know how fast cycles go. But like if you get up to like 22 miles an hour, it's going to be too much. You're going to be burning too much oxygen and you're going to eventually run out of breath, right? So metabolic equivalents are pretty handy, but they don't really come up that often in a regular gym environment, like when you're working with your clients and stuff. But you will sometimes see them. Like if you look at a treadmill, I'm sure a lot of you guys might be thinking right now, if you've ever been on a treadmill and it says like how many calories you're burning per hour and how many miles per hour you're traveling, and it'll say all these stats and they're kind of rolling around. It's like shows you this stat, then that stat, then that stat. One of them it will sometimes say is METs, right? It'll say like this many METs, right? Those are your metabolic equivalents. So it's like, hey, that cardio that you just did burned 6.5 METs. Well, here's how you can think of that. It's like, oh, you burned 6.5 times more calories while you were doing that than you would have if you were at home on the couch right now. And that's how I like to use METs. That's how I like to explain to my clients. I'm like, we got you working at about 3 METs. You're burning 3 times as many calories as you would be, right? Or I got you working at 15 METs. Holy crap. That's 15 times. That's a hard workout. So that's really the only time METs are actually going to come up. For the most part, they just like to have you know this statistic. They like to have you know that's 3.5 milliliters per minute. Even though, honestly, guys, take it from me, you don't actually use it that often in the real world. But again, it's the difference between what is actually useful and what makes good test questions. All right, last thing I do want to talk about is dysfunctional breathing. So occasionally, we're going to screw this all up. We are going to use those secondary respiratory muscles that we're not supposed to. We're going to have bad posture. That bad posture is going to screw up your ability to expand your lungs. Let's say I sit all day like this. I just get really used to being in this position right here, right? Rounded shoulders, arched back. If I get used to being in that position all day, what's going to end up happening is it's going to keep my lungs from being able to expand the way they're supposed to. And I'm just not going to be able to bring in oxygen the way I'm supposed to. So my body's going to go, man, we need oxygen. So it's going to start using secondary respiratory muscles. And those secondary respiratory muscles, like I said, are often also postural muscles. So then it gets even worse. My posture starts to get even worse, right? This is why we see, dysfunctional breathing patterns, right? So improper breathing patterns can affect your posture. Posture can affect your breathing patterns. Function follows form, form follows. It kind of goes back and forth, right? So during shallow breathing patterns, for instance, where maybe you're at a desk all day and you're hunched over like this, right? Your secondary respiratory muscles, those are like your abdominals, your sternocleidomastoid, your scalenes, right? These neck muscles, they start to kind of help. They start to have you breathe like this. But remember, those muscles are also in charge of doing things like lateral raises and presses, all that kind of movement. So now, suddenly, you start to get used to being in this rounded position. And just right now, guys, try to round your shoulders. And you try with your shoulders in that position to get them all the way up overhead. Literally impossible, right? Only when they are in the proper alignment can you raise them all the way up. And so shallow breathing patterns can lead to dysfunctional breathing, and dysfunctional breathing can lead to shortness of breath. It can lead to headaches, nausea, and it can lead to things like shoulder impingement. And that's why later on in this mod, when we talk about like postural assessments, we're going to look to see, is your client in proper alignment, right? Or are they rounding and moving their head forward like this? If they're moving like that, we need to address that by stretching out those muscles to get them to allow them to get back to a neutral posture, which will allow them to effectively breathe. So, summarizing everything up, your respiratory system is responsible for gathering oxygen from the environment through your respiratory passageways, and that is all powered by your respiratory pump. As our cells use oxygen, they are going to burn up that oxygen and attach it to some carbon to become CO2. CO2 needs to get out of the body because that is sort of our waste product. So we need to get rid of that, which we will do through exhalation. And so we are going to inhale oxygen and exhale CO2. All of this is made possible thanks to your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways. And then that's going to work very intimately with your cardiovascular system, where the heart, blood, and blood vessels are going to allow that oxygen to be able to be transported around. And if there is ever dysfunction in your cardiorespiratory system, that can affect your human movement system. That can affect your muscular and your skeletal and your nervous systems, which means you're not going to move the way you're supposed to, which means you'll either be an inefficient athlete or you're going to end up with an actual overuse injury, which is definitely something we are trying to avoid. So definitely a lot of information today. I think that is the most information. There may be one more day that's like relatively heavy like this, but I think that's the most amount of info that we're going to have in one day for the rest of this entire module. So we can look forward to kind of slowing down a little bit after this. But any questions today, guys? How are y'all feeling?
Feeling good.
What day are we on? We get homework tonight?
We do get homework today. Yep, it's day 8 today.
Okay. And it's a 12-day class?
Yeah, yep. It's a 12-day class. So we get today is homework 3. It's Wednesday, right? So then Friday will be homework 4. And then we will be meeting on Tuesday. Day 11 will be Monday. Day 12 will be the final and our next in-person meetup.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ciao.
All right.
All right, bro.
Ladies